In just 4 minutes, one classified trade audit destroyed the most progressive leader in the Western world. I've covered 267 international summits. I've witnessed diplomatic breakdowns, trade wars, alliance collapses. But what happened at 11:47 a.m. on June 8th at Schloss Elmau wasn't just diplomacy, it was systematic evisceration of Justin Trudeau by a woman who had built an irrefutable CANZUK trade fraud case, exposing the biggest Commonwealth betrayal in modern history. Kemi Badenoch walked into the Alpine Summit room, carrying a reinforced diplomatic case sealed with UK Trade Department and CSIS stamps. She looked like an international prosecutor who had assembled evidence to destroy a criminal network built on exploiting Commonwealth partnerships. What none of us knew was that case contained audit documents exposing $4.2 billion in CANZUK trade fund diversions to shell companies controlled by Trudeau's network. But she didn't open it immediately. The silence before evisceration was electric. The conference room went still. Not respectful summit courtesy, but absolute silence when everyone senses a world leader's reputation destruction. At 11:46 a.m., Trudeau's trade advisor received an urgent encrypted message. Her face transformed from confident to terrified as she whispered something desperate in French. Trudeau's progressive charm cracked. His CANZUK director was frantically checking emergency communications. He looked like someone who knew 7 years of progressive internationalism was about to be exposed as G7's biggest Commonwealth trade fraud. And then Badenoch unlocked her diplomatic case. "Prime Minister Trudeau," she began, her voice carrying prosecutorial authority, "I want to discuss CANZUK trade partnerships and concerning financial irregularities brought to my attention through Five Eyes intelligence." Standard G7 opening. Nothing threatening. Trudeau looked relieved, confident. His media team were preparing responses about conservative attacks on progressive trade policy. But Badenoch's case was positioned precisely, open to a tab marked with UK trade intelligence and CSIS seals. This wasn't routine G7 discussion. This was systematic prosecution. "Prime Minister Badenoch," Trudeau replied in his Ottawa accent, "Canada remains committed to strengthening Commonwealth trade partnerships that reflect our progressive values and equitable development." Perfect diplomatic deflection. But Badenoch wasn't interested in trade philosophy. She was building towards something devastating, like an investigator with documents to destroy years of fraudulent claims. "Prime Minister Trudeau," she said, removing a document, "are you familiar with the Commonwealth Advanced Trade Facilitation Office, established in Toronto on September 15th? The question hit the G7 summit like diplomatic dynamite. Trudeau's expression didn't change, but I watched his hands. They went rigid. When progressive leaders' hands stop moving during trade discussions, their survival instincts have activated. "Prime Minister Badenoch," Trudeau replied, maintaining composure but lacking confidence, "Canada works with numerous trade facilitation bodies as part of our comprehensive approach to progressive Commonwealth partnerships." Wrong answer. Catastrophic. When asked about a specific trade office in your own country with a specific date, generic answers suggest massive cover-up. Badenoch pulled out a second document with Canadian trade intelligence stamps and Five Eyes classification markings. "Prime Minister Trudeau," she continued, gaining momentum, "according to these trade audit documents, the Commonwealth Advanced Trade Facilitation Office has processed $4.2 billion in CANZUK development funds since." A shockwave rippled through G7 observers. $4.2 billion represented nearly the entire annual CANZUK trade budget. But Badenoch was just beginning her systematic evisceration. "And Prime Minister," she said, producing a third document, "these files show that only $680 million of those funds ever reached their intended CANZUK recipients." The conference room fell silent. Not diplomatic courtesy. This was G7 leaders processing information that could destroy careers and trigger criminal investigations. Trudeau's advisor leaned forward, his training inadequate for criminal allegations. His media handler stopped checking communications, staring at Badenoch with disaster shock. But what happened next changed everything. Trudeau shot forward, his legendary progressive composure evaporating. Prime Minister Badenoch, these allegations represent serious mischaracterization of legitimate Commonwealth trade development coordination processes. Prime Minister Trudeau, Badenoch interrupted, cutting through the protest. Are you denying that you personally signed authorization documents for $344 billion in CANZUK funds that have disappeared from official audit trails? Silence. Absolute silence. For 19 seconds, I counted. Trudeau said nothing. 19 seconds in high-stakes G7 proceedings equals admission of international guilt. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. The confident progressive prime minister was gone, replaced by panic with a Canadian accent. I signed numerous authorization documents as part of Canada's trade development coordination responsibilities. I cannot recall every specific funding arrangement referenced in these allegations. Devastating response. When a progressive world leader says, I cannot recall about $354 billion in missing CANZUK trade funds while claiming to champion equitable development, it sounds like systematic international trade fraud conducted under progressive values cover. Badenoch opened her case one final time and removed the smoking gun that ended Trudeau's progressive international leadership. Prime Minister, she said, her voice now carrying absolute authority. Perhaps this will help refresh your trade development memory. She placed a surveillance photograph on the conference table. The image showed Trudeau at an exclusive Muskoka resort, celebrating with expensive champagne, while CANZUK trade officials were visible in the background. This photograph was taken by Canadian Security Intelligence at the Deerhurst Resort in Muskoka on July 1, 2023, Canada Day, the same weekend that $1.8 billion in CANZUK trade funds were transferred to accounts that Five Eyes agencies cannot trace. The timing was devastating. Canada Day celebration, same weekend, same luxury location. This wasn't progressive Commonwealth trade development. This was documented enrichment by someone who claimed to champion equitable partnerships while secretly stealing Commonwealth funds. Trudeau's face drained of color. His hands were visibly shaking. Not diplomatic nervousness, actual trembling visible to every world leader. In the Canadian delegation section, his trade team was typing frantically, sending emergency damage control instructions to every Canadian trade post and Commonwealth High Commission. But Badenoch wasn't finished eviscerating Canada's progressive prime minister. Prime Minister, she continued, producing another document with RCMP financial crimes investigation seals. I also have internal Canadian government communications showing you personally overruled trade audit recommendations that flagged the Commonwealth Advanced Trade Facilitation Office as a potential criminal fraud operation. At 11:51 a.m., 4 minutes after she'd begun speaking, Justin Trudeau experienced complete progressive political breakdown. His voice was barely audible through translation systems. Prime Minister Badenoch, these documents lack proper context. Commonwealth trade development requires complex coordination arrangements. Be stopped mid-sentence. 24 seconds of silence. I have never seen a G7 leader unable to complete a sentence during summit proceedings. The silence was broken by Badenoch's calm response. Prime Minister, I'm not questioning complex arrangements. I'm questioning $3.54 billion in CANZUK trade funds that disappeared while Commonwealth nations struggled to develop equitable trade relationships. The accusation hung in the Alpine room like diplomatic poison. This wasn't just about trade policy. This was about systematic betrayal of progressive responsibility by the world leader, who claimed to champion Commonwealth equity while secretly enriching his network. Trudeau's diplomatic advisor was whispering urgently in French, but even he seemed to recognize that standard progressive damage control was inadequate for international criminal allegations of this magnitude. Furthermore, Badenoch continued, opening her final folder, Five Eyes Intelligence Analysis, confirms that these missing CANZUK trade development funds were systematically diverted to accounts controlled by luxury resort networks throughout Ontario, British Columbia, and the Maritime provinces. The expansion from individual corruption to systematic luxury diversion across multiple Canadian provinces demonstrated that this wasn't isolated fraud. This was criminal enterprise designed to enrich progressive Canadian officials. At 11:52 a.m., Trudeau made the decision that ended his progressive international credibility. We will need to review these allegations with our legal teams and provide appropriate responses through established Canadian government procedures. Wrong answer, internationally fatal. When accused of systematically stealing $3.5 billion in Commonwealth trade development funds, you don't promise to review allegations. You categorically deny or admit guilt. Promising procedural review sounds like buying time to destroy evidence. The G7 conference room erupted in chaos. German Chancellor Scholz demanded clarification. French President Macron's advisor was calling Paris. Italian Prime Minister Meloni's delegation was discussing emergency Commonwealth trade sessions. In the press gallery, correspondents were typing frantically. The Financial Times correspondent spoke urgently. This could end Trudeau's progressive international leadership. We're watching Canadian trade credibility collapse in real time. As the G7 session concluded, I overheard conversations confirming what every world leader was thinking. Il est fini. Ist erledigt. He's finished. The $4.2 billion CANZUK trade fraud wasn't just about trade coordination, it was about a progressive champion who had systematically betrayed Commonwealth nations by stealing their development funds. By 2:30 p.m. Alpine time, Trudeau trade scandal was trending globally. By 3:15 p.m., the RCMP confirmed immediate investigation. By 4:07 p.m., 12 Commonwealth nations demanded emergency meetings. Every major network ran wall-to-wall CANZUK coverage, exposing Canada's Prime Minister as a trade-stealing hypocrite who betrayed progressive responsibility for personal luxury. And it all started with one diplomatic case, carried by a woman who had built an unbreakable case against the world's most prominent progressive leader. What I witnessed wasn't just G7 diplomacy. It was the moment when trade audit evidence obliterated progressive authenticity, when documented fraud defeated international theater, and when forensic preparation destroyed a leader's entire global progressive identity. The G7 summit continued 2 more days, but everyone knew the outcome. Trudeau's credibility as progressive international champion was finished. His authority as Commonwealth trade leader was destroyed. Canada's progressive authenticity had shifted permanently away from trade-stealing politicians. Sometimes international justice takes years through G7 investigations. Sometimes it takes 4 minutes in an Alpine conference room. On June 8th, I watched Kemi Badenoch prove that in international diplomacy, documented evidence always defeats progressive performance. The only question was how much damage Canada's progressive betrayal would do to Commonwealth trust before the truth finished destroying Trudeau's international career. If this exposure of progressive betrayal restored your faith in international accountability, don't just watch, like, share, and subscribe to our channel, where trade scandals get exposed and diplomatic lies get prosecuted, no matter which progressive accent they hide behind. Hit the bell. The next international trade fraud might involve your nation's development partnerships. What would you do if you discovered your progressive leader had been stealing Commonwealth trade development funds meant to help developing nations? Drop a comment below. This analysis is based on G7 summit proceedings and international trade audit documentation. All dialogue and specific details are dramatized for educational and commentary purposes.